Hello class, this is lesson 1-5, distance and cost. We are also going to be learning about formulas and variables, and this is the Learning Needed channel. For reference material, I do use the Kaplan GED test prep book. Specifically, I use year 2024 to 2025. However, any previous year version of the book should work as well. I have found in browsing the different years of the same book that they typically have the same breakout in sections, and they even sometimes share the same word problem word for word, or sorry, the same problems word per word. They're the same. So also for the GED math test, the only approved calculator you can physically take with you to the exam is the Texas Instruments 30XS model, and I have links to purchase the calculator as well as the test prep book in my video description below. As always, I have my request to the students to remember your reason to pass the GED test. Your reason is yours alone. Don't compare to anybody else's reasons. And once you get that GED certificate, it will be a great benefit to you in the long run. Second is don't give up. This is not meant to be easy. This is a test, which means that you have to study for it, prepare for it, take practice exams, work on your test-taking skills, know how to use a calculator. And so it will show that once you get that certificate that your hard work paid off. And finally, please like and subscribe to this video so that I can produce more GED content, not just in math, but in all 4 subjects. My long-term plan is to have these type of videos that cover the whole Kaplan GED test prep book for all 4 subjects. And I can only do that with your support. Also, if interested, I do have one-on-one tutoring services offered for all GED subjects, and you can look that up in my website, which is in the video description below. All right, let's get started. First, we are going to cover distance. So welcome to your first formula. A formula describes a constant relationship in math that never changes. So regardless of what happens in the world, a formula is a way to always describe a specific situation in math. So the distance formula can be represented as the distance is equal to the rate times the time. And I have there in parentheses, d is equal to r times t. So variables are letters used to represent unknown numbers. And variables tend to be in 2 main categories. One is the most common category where it doesn't represent a known factor or in a formula. It is just an unknown number, and that typically tends to be the letters x, y, and z. And then there are variables that help you identify specifically what they represent. So for example, in the distance formula, the variables are d, r, and t, where d stands for distance, which is the first letter in the word, r is for rate, and t is for time. So that helps you identify the variables and what it stands for. So when you have a formula just by itself, it is usually just variables. So you don't know any of the numbers. Variables means that you don't know any of the numbers, but you know where they go. You know the relationship between them. So when you're using a formula, you substitute the values that you do know into the appropriate variables and solve. So what that means is if I'm looking for the distance and I know the rate and the time, then I'll substitute the known rate and the known time into the distance formula and solve for distance. So let's look at that with some example problems. So distance example problems. Number 1, how many miles can you travel if you drive at an average speed of 55 miles per hour for 3 hours? So again, the distance formula is d is equal to rt, and I have 2 pieces of information. I have that the average speed is 55 miles per hour, and I drove for 3 hours. So 3 hours is the time, and the average speed is the rate of the vehicle that you're driving, right? So I have the rate and I have the time. So rate is equal to 55 miles per hour and t is equal to 3 hours. So now that I know r and t, I can substitute them into the distance formula. So that becomes d, or distance, is equal to 55 times 3. And 55 times 3, 165. So the distance traveled at 55 miles per hour for 3 hours is 165 miles. So what I did here is that the problem gave me 2 pieces of information that I need to solve for the distance. It gave me the rate and it gave me the time. And once I knew what those were, I substituted in for the variables in the formula and solved for the answer, or the distance. So let's look at another one. Number 2, what is the distance traveled by a car averaging 60 miles per hour for 3 hours? Now, something that I tend to do as I'm reading the problem is underline or highlight the information that is important to me, that I believe is important. The distance formula is equal to distance is equal to rate times time, and it gave me 60 miles per hour, and that's the rate, and it gave me 3 hours, and that's the time. So if I substitute both of those numbers for the variables of distance is equal to rate times time, it looks like distance is equal to 60 times 3 hours. And that becomes 60 times 3, which is equal to 180 miles. And that is the distance. Again, it is just substituting the known values into the formula to get the answer. Let's move on to the next section. So now we're going to look at the cost formula. And the cost formula looks very similar to the distance formula, but we're now going to solve for a different piece of information, now related to money. So the cost formula is equal to the total cost is equal to the number of units times the price per unit. And it is represented in variable form by C is equal to N times R, where C is the total cost, N is the number of units, and R is the rate, or in this case, the price per unit. Now this one has a slight variation in variable representation in that instead of U for units, it is N for number of units, and instead of P for price per unit, it is R for rate. So it is still the first letter of the word, it's just that the word that you might have been expecting is not the same. And so really the letter that you use for the variable doesn't really matter in terms of solving and getting the correct answer, because variables are just any letter to represent it. I can change all 3 of these variables to completely different letters as long as I remember and understand the relationship between these variables. That's the only thing that matters. Let us look at some examples of cost problems. So cost problem number 1, the total cost of 4 flats of plants at $12 each. So I have 4 flats of plants and $12 each. And the cost formula is C is equal to N times R. Also, side note, you'll learn this in other lessons more carefully. But anytime you see 2 variables letters next to each other with nothing in between them, it means multiplication. So N next to R with nothing in between means multiply N, the variable N, by the variable R. So the total cost of 4 flats of plants, this is the number of units, and $12 each is the rate or the price per unit. So now that I know N and R, I am going to substitute them into the cost formula, and that becomes C, the total cost, is equal to 4 times $12, and that gives me $48. So that is the total cost of 4 flats. Problem number 2. A package of frosted cookies is $3 per package. How much would 4 packages cost before tax? So $3 per package is rate. And for cost formula, the rate is pretty easy to identify. It's the one with the dollar symbol, right? And 4 packages is the number of units. Substituting that into the cost formula becomes, my R looks like a little bit like an N, so R is 4 packages times $3 per package, and that is $12. And that is the cost formula. Let's move on to the next section. So we saw how to solve for distance and cost in the previous sections. For distance, you need to know rate and time, and for cost, you need to know number of units and price per unit. But what if the GED math test doesn't ask you to solve for distance and cost, and instead asks you to solve for one of the other units? In other words, what if the GED math test asks you to solve for rate in terms of distance? Or what if it asks you to solve for price per unit in terms of cost? What it's going to do is it's going to give you the other 2 pieces of information to solve for the information you don't have. So for distance, if it's asking for rate, it's going to give you distance and time. And if for cost, it's asking for the price per unit, it's going to give you the total cost and the total number of units. If it is not asking for distance and cost and asking for something else, how do you solve for it? Well, it comes down to, if you know two of the variables, then you can solve for the third. The distance and cost formulas can be rewritten in such a way that you solve for the third piece of information that you don't know. And it looks as follows. For distance formula, we've been working with this first one. Distance is equal to rate times time. When you rewrite this formula to solve for a different variable, it looks like the following too. If the formula is asking for rate, if the problem is asking for rate, it will give you distance and time. And you use this variation of the formula to solve for rate. Similarly, if it asks for time, it will give you the distance and the rate, and you can solve for time. Same logic with cost formula. C is equal to N times R is what we've been working with. And if it asks for number of units, it will give you total cost and the rate. And if it asks for rate or price per unit, it is going to give you total cost and number of units. So let's see what that looks like. So here are some distance and cost problems asking for a different information than just total distance and total cost. So number one, how long does it take for a bus to travel 25 miles at an average rate of 25 miles per hour? It is giving us 25 miles as distance traveled and an average rate, and this one is really easy to identify because it said the word rate, the rate of 25 miles per hour. Now remember, the formula we worked with previously is equal to D is equal to rate times time. Distance is equal to rate times time. However, it gave us distance and it gave us rate. So it gave us distance and rate. And what we're solving for is time. And the variation of the distance formula to solve for time is equal to distance divided by rate. So now you're not even multiplying to solve the answer. Now you're doing a completely different operation, the opposite operation. You're now dividing. So plugging in the known numbers for the variables in this variation of the formula, time is equal to 25 miles divided by 25 miles per hour. And that becomes 1. So the time it takes to travel 25 miles at an average rate of 25 miles per hour is 1 hour. So in this case, we did a variation of the distance formula dependent, and we chose this variation because of the information that it provided us, and we had to divide instead of multiply to solve this answer. Let's look at number 2. If 4 tires cost $320, how much does a single tire cost? This is actually pretty cool. I think if you're shopping for tires, sometimes they'll give you the package cost. In other words, the cost for 4 tires, and sometimes it'll give you the price per tire, and you have to multiply it by 4 to get all tires. Or in some case, if you're replacing 1 tire, or 2 tires, then you multiply accordingly. So this is the cost formula, and the what I'm going to call the quote-unquote default cost formula is C is equal to N times R. So I have 4 tires, and that is the number of units, and 320, where this is the total cost. So the variation of this cost formula that I have to use is the one solving for rate. And the variation is, for rate, I have to use total cost divided by number of units. Oops, I jumped ahead there, and I put in the number of units. I meant to put in the variable format, just getting a little ahead of myself there. And that is number of units. So if I substitute in now correctly, the total cost is $320 and the number of units is 4. And that, when you plug it into the calculator, is 80. So each tire individually cost $80. We used the rate to find, we used the variation of the formula where we had to find the rate in terms of total cost. 2 more examples. A bus driver drove 275 miles in 5 hours. What was their average speed in miles per hour? So it gave us the distance they traveled, 275 miles, and it gave us the time, 5 hours. So the variation that I have to use of the distance formula is the rate is equal to the distance divided by the time. So I substitute that into the formula. So 275 divided by 5 is equal to 55 miles per hour. And you can check that with the calculator. So small variation, and for the first problem we used the time variation. For the third problem we used the rate variation. And both of them we had to divide. Now the last problem. A Girl Scout troop sold $640 in cookie boxes. The cookie boxes were $20 each. How many cookie boxes did the troop sell? So $640 is the total cost, so C, and the cookie boxes were $20 each, which in the cost formula is equal to the rate or price per unit. So since I know C and I know R, I am solving for N, the number of units, which makes sense. The problem is asking how many cookie boxes, and that is number of units. So the variation here is equal to N is equal to C divided by R. And now when I substitute that into the known values into the appropriate variables, then N becomes 640 divided by 20. And that is 32 boxes. And that is using the variation of the distance and cost formulas for solving these type of problems. The main summary of this is for the distance and cost problems, it will give you two of the pieces of information and you will solve for the third with the appropriate variation of the formula. And that should get you the answer. Now, a side note, which I didn't show in these problems, but if you practice more GED problems, is that it will not always explicitly give you the they will not explicitly give you the two, just the numbers for the other two variables. You might have to do a little bit of math to get each variable, which we didn't quite cover in this lesson, but as you practice more practice problems and in my practice problem videos that are coming soon, we'll see some of those problems. But just be aware this is the main idea for distance and cost formulas. So that is all for this lesson, a little bit of a shorter one. We're starting section 2 in the next video. And please like and subscribe so that I can keep generating this content. And if you have any questions, definitely leave a comment and I will answer as soon as possible. Thank you.